Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the conversation series. I am incredibly grateful to be sitting down with Miss Amanda Lamb. She's a journalist, podcaster, author, public speaker. She's worked for WRAL for it was almost
29 years.
29,
Yeah, almost 30.
almost 30 years. But I'm grateful that she's sitting right across from me today. But Amanda, thank you for being with me, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Happy to be here.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I was actually a TV journalist for 35 years.
crazy.
Believe it or not, it's crazy.
Yeah.
Not many people do it for that long. Started when I was 10. Joking, obviously. I went to Duke undergrad,
Okay.
and then they didn't have a journalism major. So I went to Northwestern in Chicago and just knew right away that's what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
So first job was in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina.
Wow.
And I always, people laugh when I tell them how I got that job. We didn't have the internet. And so I drove 2,500 miles with a map and a couple of dry clean suits, a file full of resumes, and a box full of tapes. And back then, we're not talking.
Oh, no, it was.
They were this big. I think they were beta at that time. I can't remember, but big tapes.
Yeah.
And just knocked on doors. And so that's how I got my first job.
Wow.
And I remember specifically, they hired me for $12,500 a year.
Okay.
And I thought that was great.
Yeah.
Because I had no idea that wasn't great.
Yeah.
But I was a one-man band. Today they call them MMJs, which means you do everything. You do the shooting, the editing, and this was back when it was tape to tape. We didn't have computers.
Okay.
And so it was trial by fire, but I still loved it. Yeah. And so I knew that's what I wanted to do. I ended up going from there to Portland, Maine.
Okay.
Which a lot of people are like, wow, Portland, Maine.
That's a jump.
Best choice of my career. It was beautiful. I was in my 20s. I learned how to ski. I learned how to, do all sorts of cross country ski, water sports, hiking. Yeah. A lot of things I probably wouldn't have done if I hadn't lived there, because I grew up outside of Philadelphia in a pretty basic suburb, not unlike, the suburbs of Raleigh. And then I got offered a job in Raleigh.
Okay.
And because I'd gone to Duke, I was like, Raleigh seems like a good place to land for about 2 years.
Yeah.
That sounds like something I could do. I came down here, did the interview. They wanted me for a satellite office, which was in Fayetteville. And at the time I had worked in 2 satellite offices. We called them bureaus in TV, where you're not with the full staff. And so you don't have mentors, you don't have people to guide you. You're basically kind of on your own.
Okay.
And so I said, you know what? I think at this point in my career, I need to be in a newsroom. Thank you, but no thank you.
Okay.
And so then 3 months later, they came back and they had a job here. I came here and ended up, meeting my husband.
29 years.
And said, oh, okay, we'll try this. We'll see how this goes here in Raleigh. Yeah, that was 29 years. Have my family. I mean, I always say, my life happened here.
Okay.
And so I think that's what happens when you least expect it. Your life just kind of develops. Yeah. But the nice thing about working for a family-owned company versus a big corporation was that I was able to do other things.
Okay.
So along the way, I was able to write. And I've written 12 books. I have one coming out in the fall, but they are wide range. I've done true crime. I've done memoir. I've done mysteries. I've done a couple of children's books. And then also just a lot of public speaking and a lot of appearing on national true crime shows. Again, these are all things that if I worked for a bigger company or a company that was owned by a network, I probably wouldn't have been able to do. So WRAL Capital Broadcasting kind of let me spread my wings, which was really nice.
Yes. And I just want to, I love to jump back to your beginning story and just what about journalism for you? Where did your passion start there? Were you a writer growing up as a kid? Like what?
Yeah,
how did you get there?
I started writing at 4, and I remember this really specifically. When I do book talks, I talk about this with people. I have some of the original books that I wrote when I was a little kid. So construction paper covers with the crayon illustrations stapled together. And back then, we always used this lined paper when we were in school to learn how to handwrite. Yep. So lined paper. And my first book was called The Dog That Ate the Frog. I think I have that right. So I think that was my first true crime. It was a mystery.
I love it.
So yeah, I love to write. I always loved to write. And so it was just something that, I did for fun.
Okay.
I was always in writing groups, where you would critique each other's work.
Yes.
And so at Duke, I was a creative writing major. So at first, I told my parents I was just going to go write books. And they told me, no, you're going to get a job because, yeah, you're going to get a job.
Yes.
So they were right. I also didn't have anything to write about yet because you have to live a little bit to have some, with a few exceptions, but to have something really important to write about. So I ended up going to journalism school to kind of hone those skills. But I was also into acting growing up. I was into community theater, school theater. So it really kind of connected those things, the performance aspect and the writing. And I never looked back. I also think that writing is just like anything else. It's like running, it's like tennis, it's like golf. You have to practice.
Yep.
And so I was producing about 8 minutes of news a day before I retired. That's a lot of writing. And writing concisely, writing efficiently, writing to engage. It was the best training I could have ever had for any kind of writing that you do. And of course, now I never got to that part. I'm an independent podcaster. So I have a show called AGELESS Opening Doors with Amanda Lamb. And it's basically talking to women over 50 about life transformation, personal and professional, and kind of digging into that wisdom.
And digging into your podcast side, like you had podcasts with WRAL, you were doing all sorts you were at true crime podcasts there too.
I was. So I did 3 true crime podcasts with them. The first one was called Follow the Truth. And that was about we reinvestigated the 1993 murder of Michael Jordan's father, James Jordan. And we won a regional Edward R. Murrow for that, for excellence in journalism. So our team was really proud of that. The next one was called What Remains, which I basically came up with. We were looking for a new show. And so my producer and I, Wilson Sayre, created this podcast where we would take one case that there were remains and we would look at connecting those remains to missing and murdered people. And the jumping off point was that we learned that every state has remains and they are kept by the state. They are kept by the medical examiner. Here in North Carolina, some of those remains are kept at NC State because we have a forensic scientist there named Dr. Ann Ross, who's amazing. So she was kind of our jumping off point. And then we did stories all over the world. So we did 20 episodes. After that, our most recent one was The Killing Month, August 1978. Again, this was just something that was always kind of spinning in my head. It was a story I wanted to do. My dad was a prosecutor in the rural area that I lived in growing up in Pennsylvania. And this was his biggest case. And when he retired and downsized, he said, I have some files and some newspaper clippings. Do you think you'd be interested? And I took them, put them in a box, didn't even think about it. And then Capital Broadcasting said, hey, any other ideas? And I thought, you know what? This has been in my brain for a long time. It has been a movie. It's been a book. But I'm like, it hasn't been a podcast. And I have access to all these people through my dad because he connected me. I mean, a lot of them are in their 80s. This happened 45 years ago. So it's kind of a good old fashioned gangsters in the country. And then they end up killing witnesses. And there's a lot of mystery to it and a lot of really interesting characters.
I mean, that box is just sitting in your
and
house,
what was interesting is, this is obviously pre-internet. So my dad had kept and dated every single newspaper article. So I'm talking like hundreds of newspaper articles because it was covered nationally and it was covered locally. And so I sat there literally at my dining room table every night because I still had to do day work for WRAL. So every night I sat there at my dining room table for 3 to 4 hours and took notes. And so it was really, it was amazing. And it was great to work with my dad, but more specifically to understand my dad more and his work, because we had a pretty traditional upbringing, in the 70s. Dad goes to work, kids go to school. And so it was really interesting to have the experience to walk through this with him and learn more about him and his journey. And I was really proud of him because as a journalist, I'm so used to interviewing people who don't want to talk or who say things that mean nothing. And, you're still trying to get them to be specific. And so in this instance, I was able to go back and see all the interviews that he did. And I was really proud of how he handled himself.
Well, that's incredible. And like, as you were saying that, I'm like, it's like bonding time you got to have with your dad too, as you were going through that. But I think when you peel back, like I resonate with that because you're peeling back your
Sure.
dad and you're peeling back some things that you didn't see as you were growing up or during your
No.
childhood, which is amazing to me.
Yeah.
Just
And
to be able to
I
see that.
went to the trials. So, and I remember the case unfolding. I remember my parents talking about it in the kitchen. I remember detectives coming to the house. And I remember lots of activity. So I heard snippets of conversations, but I didn't know all the details, obviously, as a
Yes.
kid. And then my parents were both lawyers. So they thought, oh, 13 years old,
Yeah.
come on to the murder trial. Sounds like a great idea. But it was because
Yeah.
I think in some ways, well, in many ways, that experience honed my interest in criminal
Yes.
justice. And I was
Yeah.
a crime reporter
Yeah.
for most of my career. So I really was always interested in taking a case, the puzzle of a case, how
Yeah.
they took all these different parts of it and put it together
Absolutely.
and created a story for the
Yeah.
jury to be able to really understand
Yep.
it. And in this trial, I mean, there were hundreds of witnesses. There's no GPS, there's no surveillance video, there's no text messaging.
Yeah.
There's none of that. I mean, it's all good old fashioned
Yes.
police work and witnesses. People, they had to turn people who weren't great people.
Yes.
They had done bad things, but they had seen the guys that had done the worst
Yep.
things.
Yep.
And that was how they did it.
Well, and I think what's so interesting to me about true crime is it's like you can really go down some rabbit holes and just you get sucked in so quickly because these are things that sometimes to the public, like you're just not seeing some of this information.
Sure.
So when you're kind of hearing about this, you're like, people are really uncovering all of these things and solving all of these crimes, but it's so fascinating just to hear how
they do
deep
it.
it really goes.
Yeah. I mean, as a crime reporter, I used to always say I report about 10% of what I know.
Wow.
And so I've written a mystery series and I have another
Okay.
book coming out in the fall. So I feel like in a mystery series, in a fictional
Yes.
way, I can take a lot of these stories that I've never been able to tell
Yeah.
and kind of weave them in. So there's always a
Okay.
grain of truth. I mean,
Yeah.
certainly the characters are different. I've changed the stories. I've pulled them away from
Yes.
the actual headlines and made them into something, with my imagination. But what I will tell you from all the years that I worked in crime and watching true crime podcasts,
Yeah.
watching true crime shows, what people don't realize is that prosecutors, they have to be able to prove something.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what people
Yeah.
think. It doesn't matter what people say. If they can't prove it, it doesn't matter.
Yep.
And so my dad talked about in his case, and he had a great assistant district attorney named Dolores Troiani, who I suspect did the yeoman's work. I mean, in the 70s, you have a female.
Absolutely.
She was a force of nature. She was
Okay.
amazing.
Love
But
it.
and I was able to interview her for the podcast.
Oh, I
but
love that.
she and my dad, put together this case. And what they did was they said, okay, if this bad guy who we've
Yeah.
turned, he's a snitch, he's a witness, says X, Y, and Z happened, we need to get regular people to say X, Y, and Z happened.
Yep.
They were at the McDonald's drive-through. They got gas here.
Yep.
We need to get literally every single person to put those dots together because we can't rely on the snitch.
Yeah.
But we use the other people to prove what the snitch is saying is true. So it's a lot of work. It's tremendous.
Crazy.
And there's so many cases that I covered here in Raleigh and Wake County that there were so many elements that never came out at trial. And they may have been true.
Yeah.
But the prosecutors were very careful not to bring things forward that they couldn't prove.
It's so interesting to me, like, as you were just saying, like prosecutors, they have all this information too, but it's almost like an art of storytelling, how they have to do this. And like you said, prove something. They have to prove something, but it's interesting how they do it with the information that they are given to me.
Yeah.
And you're sitting here and you watch movies and things like that, and it's all part of a script, but it's in real life, you're like, this stuff is actually happening. Like it's taking months.
It's complicated.
Yeah.
And the thing is, a trial isn't necessarily linear, right?
Yes.
So you're not hearing the story exactly as it unfolded, which can be confusing for a jury. So somehow at the end, you have to tie it all together.
Yeah.
And even when you're doing it in a nonlinear way, you have to remind them, why is this important?
Yes.
So, I mean, I've probably watched more murder trials than most attorneys have ever tried, because you don't try that many murder trials in your career. I mean, maybe prosecutors do, but certainly not defense attorneys. They try to, mediate those and not have to go to trial, try to make a deal. So I've learned a lot.
And it's incredible for someone who is not, you grew up in a household of lawyers. You're not a lawyer. You're not. But it's incredible the amount that you have learned and the amount that you have done in the true crime arena. Like it's incredible the amount that you've learned.
Well, what makes it nice for me when I write my fiction, or even when I do a true crime podcast, I don't have to consult with people about the criminal process or about search warrants or affidavits or any of that, because I've covered that for so many years.
Okay.
So I don't have to do the same amount of research that other people have to do. And I'm also probably going to be more careful. In other words, I'm not going to do a true crime podcast where I'm just going to be talking and saying things without attribution. That's not going to happen as being a journalist for so many years. So I'm going to be very careful to attribute everything that I say and make sure that, comes from a good source.
Totally. And now you mentioned it, independent podcaster now with your Ageless podcast. Why make the transition to go out on your own and do this by yourself after doing 6 years with WRAL with all of the podcasts?
Yeah. So WRAL, we did the true crime podcast, and then they wanted to go in a new direction. They wanted to do a daily podcast, which was just an interview show about stories that we were doing for TV. And so I did that for a while, and I really enjoyed that. But I knew that I wanted to do more podcasting, broader podcasting. And I was really tired from the reporting. The reporting was it's really a great job. I learned so much, but from doing that so many years, and, it's a 10-hour day, you're in a car all day. And really, like I said, about 8 minutes producing your shows. So your segments. So noon, 4, 5, 6, 7.
Wow.
I was doing 3 to 5 live shots a day, 3 to 5 shows a day. And I just decided there was a little bit more out there for me to do. And this show that I started was literally like I was on a hike with a bunch of my friends. And I said, you know what? You guys all have such great stories to tell. Like every single one of them, we used to joke it's hiking therapy.
Yeah.
And I thought, you know what? I bet there's a ton of really great stories that women over a certain age have to tell, because they've walked over some hot coals, right?
Yep.
To get where they are. And it's both personal and professional.
Yeah.
So I've just been so lucky to meet some really cool women. I've learned so much, and it's just very uplifting. It feels very different to me in this stage of life, this season of life, if you will, to do something that people are getting something out of or learning from and feel good about. And, so that's kind of fun for a change.
Well, and we were talking about it beforehand. You're learning as well. You're going in and you're learning how to do a bunch of these pieces, and that's, I think, the most fun part of this journey. And we were talking about it, like podcasting, it is, you get set in your ways on what you like to do, the platforms you like to use, and all these things, but you are learning every single day.
Oh, I mean, I've learned more in the last 3 months than I've probably learned in 10 years. And I don't mean that, to be a martyr. I mean, it's been incredible. It's been incredibly challenging. Yeah. And I'll tell you, my mentors in podcasting are, Jason, you mentioned, he's one of them, are all like in their 30s and 40s. And they're helping me because I go to these meetups and I ask questions.
Yep.
And then they're like, I can help you with that. I can help you with that. The goal someday would be to have lots of people that help me.
Absolutely.
But right now I am doing it all. So I set up the shows.
Yeah.
I write the questions. I do the research. I do the interviewing. I edit the shows. I edit video for YouTube. I edit, cuts for different teases. I do my graphics on Canva. I do all my social media. I mean, all of this has been, I never did any of it. I mean, as a reporter, I had one job, and that was to get a TV story on the air. I had a platform I knew how to use, and that was all I did. That and email. I mean, I don't even know if I ever did an Excel spreadsheet or a PowerPoint before this. No, I did do them, but I'm joking. I really, my learning curve has been huge, and that's exciting to start something new and be challenged. And it also gives you the understanding and the belief that, you know what, I can do new things and hard things.
Well, I think if you're like, I'm an active learner, I think in some part of you, if you're not a learner in some sort of way, then you're standing still. Because I feel like there's something that all of us want to learn about. There's something all of us want to pursue, to just have more information on, whether it's something big and you go and do it as podcasting, you start your own podcast, or if it's something small as to how to fix something in your house. Like, everybody has a hunger to learn about something. And I think you go and find that, you go and feed that hunger as much as you possibly can.
And I also think, you know, I'm a doer. So I have always been a person that says, I'd like to publish a book. I know nothing about publishing a book. Let's try it, you know? And again, seeking knowledge. I went to panels and I talked to authors and I went to different groups. I mean, and this was, you know, a lot. It was like early 2000s. So there wasn't the same resources online. And then I just wrote a book, found an agent, got it published. Now, I had been writing my whole life and I'm still writing, and it's not that easy, you know? But I guess what I'm saying is, if you want to do something, it's within your reach, and you just have to figure out what the steps are. You just take the steps. I mean, if you want to run a marathon, you learn how do you train for a marathon? You look it up, you Google it, you go to running groups, you talk to people, you figure out the, you know, how many miles you need to go, what's your nutrition look like, all of that stuff. And so I've just always been a doer. And so this podcast was something I said, you know what, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it for 1 year and I'm going to see how it goes. And so far it's been going great. I do one a week. As you know, it's a lot of work, but I'm getting great feedback. I'm getting great, you know, guests, people coming forward, so many people coming forward saying, hey, can I be on your show? Or I know somebody who should be on your show. And so I'm kind of pouring through all those names now, trying to cultivate, to curate, you know, the best lineup. So.
What I liked though, when you and I had first talked, you made the statement that you reached out to your friends and you said it, you were on your hiking therapy walks. I mean, I started that way too. I was like, who can I get on who is first closest to me that I have known for years? And I think that people underestimate the closeness of the people, like the people that you have close to you, because I'm like, you don't have to go and shoot for the stars right away. Like, set the stage.
And then
work your way through it.
Well, and I have to, I mean, I'm going to pat myself on the back a little bit about this. I have curated the coolest tribe of women. I mean, they are the coolest group of women. And so it was really easy. Like, literally every single one of them could be on my podcast. But, you know, obviously I want to make it more than just about my friend group. So, you know, I have pulled in friends, and then I'm pulling in other people as well as I go along, or people that I know on social media, people that I knew a long time ago, so on and so forth. Obviously a lot of TV people, because that's my background. And TV people tend to be chameleons and make a lot of change. Even though I stayed where I was for 29 years, but most people don't do that. So I've been able to pull in a lot of really interesting people with interesting stories. But yeah, I mean, I've spent a good portion of my adult life cultivating friendships with women that I can learn from, that are strong, that are interesting, that are resilient. And so I didn't have to look that far to start the show. They were just all right around me. And it's just been amazing how it's gone out exponentially, how they will then say, well, hey, I have a friend from high school, or I have a friend, you know, that I used to work with. And I don't want all great stories. In other words, when I say that, I don't want the CEO who just, everything's great, she just rose to the top. I want to hear about obstacles. I want to hear about vulnerability. I want people to be raw and honest, because nothing is easy. And you obviously had
everything is not sunshine and rainbows all the time
along the way. Right. So, I mean, and that's one of my books is about caregiving because in 2012, my mother was diagnosed with a brain tumor.
Wow.
And she lived in Pennsylvania. She was a lawyer,
Okay.
had been in court the day before trying a case. And so immediately my whole life changed at that moment.
Yeah.
I mean, I took family medical leave and I became her caregiver. And it wasn't a long period of time. She had a glioblastoma, which
Okay.
is the Titanic of brain cancer.
Yeah.
It brings you to your knees immediately.
Yeah.
So she only lived 80 days. But
Wow.
that experience, I would say, was probably one of the most transformative in my life because
Yeah.
it made me view everything differently.
No doubt.
And I still, the further I get away from it, I still have lessons that I've learned and I sometimes have to tap back into them.
Mm.
And the most important one being everything we have is right now.
Yeah.
You know, we can think about tomorrow.
Yep.
We can reminisce about the past.
Yep.
But the time is a construct. The only time we have is this actual moment.
Yep.
And so if you're constantly thinking about the past or the future, you're missing this
Yes.
right here.
Yes.
And so that was so valuable to me to be with her and to glean. I had already gleaned a lot from her in her lifetime, but you know, it was a privilege to have her in my home and to care for her and to really take everything I could, all the lessons I could from her in that amount of time.
My dad always says, life is a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah.
He said, take it for what it is and focus on what is happening right now. And as I've gotten older, you have appreciation for things like that. I think when you're younger, you're like, pfft.
Well, and you're so nervous. I have a 20 and a 24-year-old and you know, they're always worrying about the future.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's not going to help.
Yep.
I mean, it's not going to make a difference. Worrying. The only thing that's going to make a difference is putting steps in place, like I said, now that will then benefit you later on, whether that's education, whether that's some kind of training. Figure out, okay, if I do this now, that might help me down the road.
Yeah.
But you still can't control anything. I mean, we're not in control.
Yeah.
We're not in charge.
Yep.
So
Absolutely.
you can get a phone call at any moment that changes your whole life.
Absolutely.
I mean, I was actually at a case in Fayetteville and my mom called and just said, I have a brain tumor and I'm in the hospital. And, you know, immediately everything changed. Get on an airplane. And from that day on, everything changed. So I just really think that it's important. And I wish I could tell my daughters, I wish I could tell all young people this to really figure out how to live your best life in the moment.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think we get so wrapped up in work today too. I'm sure your daughter's like, I feel it too. Like you have to get a job, but you have to have this many years of experience
and internships.
Like,
and
you have to be working since you were the age of 4 to be able to have the experience.
And then
to
graduate degrees and all of that. Yeah. And I will tell you, one of the things that's really changed, and it's the internet, and it's also obviously smartphones having so much involvement in our lives 24/7. We didn't have that pressure. So when I had my children in the early 2000s, I mean, if you wanted to call me, you had to call my home phone.
Yeah.
And so I ignored that. I ignored emails. I just did my thing when I was home with my family. That isn't the case today.
Yeah.
And so you have to set really good boundaries.
Yeah.
And my business was not a good business to have kids in, not going to lie. Really wasn't. Missed a lot.
Yeah.
All the afternoon stuff is when things happen for kids, games and dance events and picking up from, you know, school. I never did any of that because I had to work at least to 6:30, you know, sometimes later. And I never knew where I was going to be. Now I made that choice.
Yes.
But I also know that it might be different if I knew then what I know now about raising children, if that was maybe not the best choice. I don't know. I mean, you can't second guess yourself.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, I think that you have to set really good boundaries as a young person today. And I do see them setting boundaries.
Yes.
I mean, in my business, I had the fortune of knowing a lot of the young reporters because I was doing the podcast and I was interviewing them for the daily podcast. So it was great because we didn't know them. They came during the pandemic. We never met each other. We all worked in the field. And so I got to know them. I'd like to think I helped mentor some of them.
Yeah.
And they're pretty good. I mean, I never said no to anything throughout my whole career. Yeah. Can you work overnights? Can you work weekends? Can you work holidays? Can you come in early? Can you work a double? Yes. I would urge urge people
Yeah.
to figure out what your boundaries are.
Yeah. And I always say to everybody, I'm like, I'm grateful for the time that I grew up in. Like I'm a 1997 baby. Didn't get my first phone till I was out of 8th grade.
Yeah.
And it was so I could call my parents
Right.
when I was at middle school. And it was one of those things that I was like, I didn't grow up with a screen in front of my face.
Sure.
And so I biked everywhere with friends around the neighborhood,
That's
all
great.
this, you know what I mean? Like, I'm incredibly grateful because at the same time, like, I grew up in a somewhat time of
kind of right before
fun. Right before.
because my kids were born 2000
Yep.
and 2003 and I was able to hold on to that.
Yeah.
And we did the same thing, played in the neighborhood, rode bikes until about middle school. And that's when things started to get really focused on the phone. And if I don't have a phone, I can't have friends because everything is about texting and I'll miss out. And, you know, there was a lot of
It was different timing too, because it was, for me, it was in case anything happened at school for me. It was like, so I could call because at the same time, my friends still, it was maybe 2 of them had a phone and everybody else still did not have one. So it was like
good.
that great time, but I'm incredibly grateful that I grew up in that time.
I'm a college professor, so I teach journalism at Meredith College. I'm an adjunct. And I will tell you, we talk a lot about how the lack of socialization from the phones and from the pandemic, and then also the negative impact of social media on their self-esteem and their self-perception. It's just, I mean, I see so much damage.
It's incredible.
And you know, that's why we talk about it, because I want them to understand that, you know, adults acknowledge what they've been through is different than what we've gone through.
Absolutely.
And the lack of socialization, I think, is the biggest part. It's really hard sometimes for them to engage and to even know what the proper way. I mean, and I'm lucky. I have really polite, nice students. I really, you know, have been lucky, but I do still think that there's barriers, and they've talked about it, about being nervous and anxious about meeting new people and interacting with new people. And I think a lot of that is the pandemic. And then also just
100%.
the relying on the social media and the phones as opposed to face to face. I always want to meet people face to face if I can. When people say, oh, we can do it on Zoom, I'm like, okay.
I'd rather have an in-person meeting or meet anybody in person than do it.
It changes everything. And, you know, I go back to how I got my first job. I could have just mailed them a tape and it would have been put in a pile. But I knocked on doors and I said, do you have 5 minutes? 5 minutes. Can you talk to me for 5 minutes? And the person who hired me actually said, you know what, your tape wasn't that great, but you went to a good school and you're very ambitious and I liked you when I met you.
Love that.
So there you go.
Face to face. It matters. I'm even the type of person where I hate texting. I'm a call me. I'm like, call me on the phone. I'm like, I think it makes a huge difference, but I'm like, it's just one of those things where I'm like, have an actual conversation with somebody.
And I think the only people I actually talk to on the phone are my kids, my husband, and my dad. Most of my friends are not phone call people, but I do have one, and she lives in California, and we'll talk for like an hour. And it's really nice to be able to catch up.
I talk to my sister, my mom, and my dad every single day on the phone.
And I think sometimes when you call a young person, they're like, why are you calling me?
Why are you calling me?
Yeah, I mean, my kids are always like, you know, why are you calling me, Mom? I'm like, to say hi, to hear your voice, or, you know, love the FaceTime, to see you. I want to see you.
Absolutely.
You know,
I'm the same way. I'm like, pick up the phone. I'm like, some people just don't respond to text. I'm like, just take 5 minutes, talk to me, tell me how you are today.
Exactly. It's great.
Just nice to have an actual
it makes
conversation.
A difference. I agree.
We were talking about it briefly, and I told you I wanted to dive in. Your true crime podcast, you were doing, it was narrative based.
Correct.
And then now you're in this interview based.
Right.
I just want to, you were telling me a little bit about it, but just want to hear the differences between the two.
Sure.
And truly how different they are, and if the difficulties between.
They're very, okay. So, doing a narrative podcast, true crime in my genre, is like doing a 5,000 piece puzzle. Doing a interview podcast, I mean, maybe a 500.
Yeah.
You know, it's not that bad.
Yeah.
So when I do my podcasts, they're all linear. In other words, when I do my interview, excuse me, they're linear. I have the questions. I know where I'm beginning. I know where I'm ending.
Yeah.
The only thing I might do is cut something out if we go on like a tangent.
Okay.
But I do it from beginning to end. I'm not shifting a piece of material into the middle. It is, I tell my people it's live to tape. This is like we're doing it live.
Love it.
And so all I'm doing is going in and taking out background noise, taking out ums and ahs, taking out, again, if there was a tangent that I just think people won't understand, there's not enough context, or if I just talk too much, because sometimes I talk too much. It's hard to believe.
I do the same.
So it's really doable. I mean, an interview podcast for me, beginning to end, I'm talking like 10 hours when you look at the editing, the research, the setting up, the social media. I'm saying 10 hours. It could be 8, it could be 12, but somewhere in that range. A narrative true crime is like taking all these pieces of the puzzle and putting them together. You have to have episodes outlined, and then you do your interviews, and then you have to move parts of your interviews in and out. Similar to what I did as a TV reporter, although a TV story is 1minute and 15 seconds.
Wow.
Yeah. And a narrative true crime podcast episode is anywhere from 35 minutes to an hour. So when you're doing a narrative true crime podcast, let's say you have 8 episodes in your show, that's 8 documentaries. I mean, that's 8.
Yes.
If you were doing the equivalent of TV. What I love about it is the writing. It is, to me, creative nonfiction is my favorite writing. I do a blog, and I've done a blog for years and years. I did one called Go Ask Mom for WRL for once a week. I
love it.
Since 2010. So for a very long time. And now I do one about my podcast. And it's monthly. But I really love the ability to just talk to people, but do it in a way that's scripted.
Yep.
You're talking about something that happened and you say, yeah, you heard me right. That's right. There were 10 people there, not 7, 10. So what does that tell us? So you're not just telling a story. You're talking to the listener and you're walking them through it. But it's all scripted. And that's what people don't realize. A really good true crime podcast is scripted. And then you're working in the pieces of the interviews. And then if you're really good, you're working in that sound. So you want to hear the gates squeaking open and the door slamming and people like crunching through the grass, you know. So I like to do things on scene. I like to walk to, this is where this happened and this is what it looks like. And that's the final thing. You don't see it. So I have to tell you. I have to put you there. I have to tell you what the person looks like, and I have to describe it in a way that you're really going to see them. You're going to see the location. So that's what I love to do. And I had a great team at WRAL, so I'm a little hesitant to jump back in. I have some ideas. I'm not going to lie. I'm working on a few things, but it's a huge heavy lift, and it's not an edit that a regular person can do. You work years to be able to be a good editor of a narrative podcast. So if you're out there and you're interested in working with me, let me know. But so they're very, very different. One is long-term and one is, I can knock that out. So the easier lift is the interview podcast, but I love talking to people. I love interviewing people. So that has a lot of value to me too. They both do.
Okay. I've never dipped my toe in narrative. So for me, I'm like, interview is just, I love the interview. Because you can go in so many different directions. And that's what I love about it.
Yes. And I always loved interviewing people for WREL. I will tell you, it was funny. I would often go off script. So I would be out there with somebody in a little town talking about a murder. And then they would start telling me, well, my family's into moonshine. Well, tell me about that, So I would always learn other things about people that had nothing to do with the story. And then, maybe put a little check mark in my notebook. I need to go back and talk to that person at some point. But I also only had a really limited period of time because I had to get on TV. So, I couldn't talk to people for 30 minutes. I could talk to them for maybe 10. And even then I was rushed, and inside I'm going, you can't act rushed when you're interviewing somebody. That's not going to get the best soundbite from them. But it was pretty obvious that we were rushed all the time. So doing an interview podcast is really a gift. I get to just talk to people.
I absolutely love it. And you and I have talked about it so much. Like, it's fun. You get to continue to learn. You get to hear things that you typically wouldn't hear on a daily basis without making a reach out to somebody. But it's a blessing, and I'm so grateful for the arena that I get to sit in and get to do this. But it's I say it's a blast. I have so much fun getting to do this all the time.
Yeah, it is. And it's very intimate when you think about somebody listening to a podcast. So most of us are listening with our headphones in, with our AirPods on.
Yeah.
We're probably doing something else. So
in the
probably
kitchen,
walking the dog, in the kitchen. My
cleaning
daughter's
the house.
got me the noise cancellation ones.
Okay.
So all the time somebody will be talking to me. I'm like, what? I'm podcast.
Can't hear you.
Can't hear you. And you know, you're walking, you're running, you're grocery shopping, you're doing all these things, but this voice is coming into your head and you're having this very personal experience versus, you know, watching something where you may be distracted and you're just not paying as close attention, or you're reading something and then your mind wanders.
Yeah.
So I think it's a great genre, and I think it's a genre to meet a different audience. I don't think that many young people, I mean, based on my students, are watching television news or watching anything.
I'll say I'm not.
Other than streaming.
Yeah.
Most of us aren't watching it, even former news people, because I look at my websites, I look at WRAL, I look at the New York Times, I look at whatever every day, you know, BBC, CNN, whatever. And you scroll down and then you pick what you're interested in.
Yep.
And so if I'm really interested, I'll click on it.
Okay.
If I'm really, really interested, I might look at the video.
Okay.
So it's really, it's changed how we receive information.
Yeah.
And podcasts are where a lot of young people are receiving information.
Yeah. My dad asked me, he said, what do you think is going to be the next medium after podcasting? I said, I can't even see past it right now.
Right. I mean, who would have thought of it? And it was funny. My dad, the one I did the podcast with, is 80, just turned 84. And so when I first started podcasting, which would have been around 2020, 2021, he was like, well, what is that? I don't understand. What is that? And I said, okay, Dad, you remember time before he was born in 1940, before you had a TV. What did you do? How did you receive information? And he said, the radio. And I said, what about shows or stories or something that, you know, was more interesting or geared towards kids? He said, yeah, you sat around the radio and you listened. I said, that's what a podcast is. Yeah. That's it.
Yeah.
It's just that you can get it in your car. You can get it on your phone.
Yeah.
And so I set him up, and now, you know, he listens every week and he loves it. But I do think we're missing a whole audience if we don't find them where they are.
Yeah.
And they are not on traditional news websites
anymore.
They are on TikTok, and they are on, you know, all sorts of social media. Yeah. And that's where we have to meet people if we want to share information with them.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think it's getting bigger. And I had heard that there was some large amount of blogs now, but there was an exponential smaller amount of podcasts out there. And that's what, like, people are like moving away from blogs and moving more towards podcasts. So I was like,
why not?
Why not?
And I also think that it's really important. I live in a condo building that's multi-generational, and we're all friends. And it's really important to learn from people who've gone before you.
Yeah.
And also to learn from younger people who have new ideas and energy and see things in a different way and maybe know how to do things better than you do.
Yeah.
And I love that combination. And I think that's what podcasting has done for me.
Yeah.
It's opened me up to all sorts of learning from different generations. And I think that we have to do that. I think that's where we shine. If we can be open to learning from people of all different generations, backgrounds, diverse stories.
Yeah.
I think that, you know, learning is endless.
Yes.
Curiosity is endless.
Yeah. I can't thank you enough for being here with me today and letting me dip my toe in your world and getting to learn more about what you've been doing. And I can't wait to see what you do with AGELESS and what this year holds with this podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited, and people can hear it anywhere they get their podcasts. So, you know, Spotify, Apple. It's AGELESS : Opening Doors with Amanda Lamb.
Okay.
Because after I named it, I realized AGELESS is part of a lot of titles. Didn't check that, the SEO on that. Didn't check that one out.
Yeah.
But anyway, I love the title. So you just have to put the : Opening Doors.
Yes.
But I hope people enjoy it. I think there's a lot of really good stories.
I love it. And I'm going to have all of Amanda's socials, her podcast linked down below so you guys can go give it a listen and follow along with her. But thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you for having me. It was awesome.
Yes,
It was so fun.
absolutely. And as always, I will see you guys back here next time. Bye, y'all.